class, welcome back, and we're going to start this morning Unit 11. We're going to look at the respiratory system. Now, of course, what we're going to always start with is we're going to define what we're talking about. So what is respiration? Now, respiration is the process where oxygen is taken from the environment, so from the air, and it's delivered to the cells. Now, while that's happening, of course, the carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of our metabolism, is transported in the opposite direction so that the carbon dioxide gets back into the environment. So oxygen goes from the environment to the body, and carbon dioxide goes from the body back to the environment. Now, respiration is going to occur in 4 different phases, and I'll just briefly talk about it now, but we'll go into a little bit more detail later in this unit. So there's the pulmonary ventilation, the external exchange of gases, gas transport in the blood, and internal exchange of gases. So the first one, the pulmonary ventilation, this is simply where air comes from the atmosphere and gets into the lungs, and of course the smallest structure in the lungs is the alveoli. The external exchange of gas still occurs in the lungs, and this is where oxygen from the air moves into the air sacs and then eventually moves into the alveoli. And then, of course, carbon dioxide is going to travel in the opposite path, move from the alveoli into the air sacs. Gas is transported through the blood, so blood circulates through the body, through the circulatory system, like we've talked about, and it brings oxygen to the cells of the body, and of course it picks up carbon dioxide and brings it back to the lungs. And then finally we have the internal exchange of gases. Now this occurs not in the lungs this time, but this occurs in the tissues of the body. And this is where at the capillaries we'll get oxygen diffusing from the blood into the cells, and then the carbon dioxide passes from the cells into the blood. So that's the 4 stages or 4 phases of respiration. If we look at this picture, we can kind of show them out. So our pulmonary ventilation is going to be this area right here where air comes into the lungs from the outside, and this is looking at it from the left and right lung. The next phase, which is the external exchange of gases, is going to happen inside the lungs at the alveoli in the capillaries. So it's going to happen in this area right here. The oxygen is going to move into the lungs, into the arteries. Of course, that's going to travel back into the heart. And then the carbon dioxide is going to come from the returning blood, the deoxygenated blood, and that's going to be exhaled out. The next thing is the transportation of gases in the blood, and of course that's going to be when we have the blood moving around the body, taking the oxygen from the lungs to all of the tissues in the systemic circuit. And the last one, the last phase, is going to be the internal exchange of gases, and that's what we're going to see happening at the tissues, where the gas is diffusing, oxygen is diffusing into the tissues, and at the same time carbon dioxide is moving back into the blood. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the unit. So let's have a look at the main structures of the respiratory system. Now this system is a little bit more well defined than the last couple of systems we talked about, like the endocrine or the lymphatic system. So we have definite structures that we can work with. The primary structures, starting at the most anterior part, is going to be the nasal cavities. Okay, so we breathe mostly through our nose. So the entrance of gas happens mainly through the nasal cavity. So they're a very important first step in breathing, respiration. Right below that, let's see if I can point these out a little bit to you. So we've got our nasal cavity, which is going to be right here. Right below that we have the pharynx. So the pharynx is going to include, let me change color. It's going to be this area right here. That's going to be the pharynx. Immediately below the pharynx we're going to have the larynx, that area, and then we'll move into the trachea, which is this tube, and from the tube we branch into the bronchi, which are these big trunks that you can see in the lungs, and then the lungs, of course, are going to be these structures right here. So it's fairly easy to see in that picture. If I just get rid of all my scribbles, you should be able to see it. It's well outlined there for you. We'll come back and we'll talk about these structures as we move through the unit. Okay, so the nasal cavity. So this is the first point in the respiratory system where air enters the body. When the air enters the nasal cavity, it's separated, of course, by the nasal septum. We have two nostrils, so the air gets moved into two sides. Inside the nasal cavities, we have a big covering that's completely full of mucous membrane. Okay. Now, remember, the mucous membrane are quite important because they have that lymphoid tissue that works around in there. So we've got an element of our immune system functioning in the mucous membrane surrounding the nasal cavity. On the lateral walls, so on the side walls of each nasal cavity, there's going to be these projections called the conchae. Now, what these do is they serve to increase the surface area. So if we've got more surface area in the nasal cavity, we've got more mucous membrane, which means we're going to have more lymphoid tissue there, so a bigger chance of intercepting anything with our immune system before it gains entry to the body. Now, when we breathe in, as air contacts the nasal lining, a couple of things are going to happen. First, the foreign bodies, anything pathogen or bacteria or viruses or anything like that, dust, it's going to get filtered out by the hairs and the mucus that are present in the nasal cavity. Okay, so that's a physical barrier right there. Another thing that happens is the air gets heated up. So we have lots of blood vessels in the nasal cavity, so we keep the core temperature is going to be warmer, and we warm up the air. Now, just think about, why would we warm the air before we breathe it in? Does it make sense to breathe cold air into our chest, and which has a chance to cool down our blood? So think about that in terms of thermoregulation and homeostasis. And finally, the air is moistened. So we make the air damp or wet, and this is really, really important when we talk about gas exchange. So the next step right below the nasal cavity is going to be the pharynx. Now, the pharynx is what carries food and liquids to our digestive system when we eat and we swallow, but it'll also carry air into the respiratory tract. Now, we divide the pharynx up into three different sections, and that's based on where it's found. So the nasopharynx is going to occur at the end of the nasal cavity. The oropharynx you're going to find at the back of the mouth, and then the laryngeal pharynx is going to be immediately below that and above the larynx. Now, right below the pharynx, we'll find the larynx. Now, this is a structure that's a little bit different because it's got a dense framework of cartilage that holds it together, and makes it a more rigid structure than the others. It's often referred to as the voice box because in this area we have these folds of mucous membranes, and those membranes vibrate as air passes through them. So that's what allows us to make different sounds, that allows us to talk, communicate, and so on. Now, just as a kind of a side note, you don't need to worry about this right here. We won't test you on this, but that's just letting you know that because the folds that we have, so we often call them the vocal cords, mucous membranes. So folds of mucous membranes are often referred to as the vocal cords. They tend to be a little bit more dense and a little bit larger in men, and as a result, men's voices tend to be a bit deeper. But like I said, don't worry about that for the test. Now, the space that we find between those mucous membrane folds, the vocal cords, is known as the glottis, and that's where food and liquids or air can pass. During swallowing, there's a small tissue called the epiglottis, and when you swallow, the epiglottis covers over the trachea. And the trachea, of course, is the windpipe, and that's the pipe that brings air into the lungs. So when we swallow, we have a reflex that covers over that trachea so that our food never goes into our respiratory system. It always goes into our digestive system. Now, there's also a few muscles that help along the epiglottis so that we make sure that the trachea closes when we swallow so we don't get food into our respiratory system, which could be big trouble. So right below the larynx we have the trachea, and this is commonly referred to as the windpipe. That's because this brings gas from the external environment directly into the bronchi into the lungs. So it goes from the inferior edge of the larynx into the chest, and it remains open, so your trachea never collapses. It stays open because there's a framework of cartilage there to keep it as an open tube. If you've ever watched some of these medical shows, a lot of shows on TV, if somebody gets something stuck in their throat, for example, and they start to choke, they'll do a tracheotomy, which is a surgery where they put a hole in the neck, and what they do is they make it easy for air to get into and out of the lungs, despite the fact that there's a blockage there. That doesn't happen very often. Okay, that's one of the things that we just see on TV because it looks cool, but in reality it's a pretty rare thing to do. So not common in real life at all, but it seems like it comes on every second or third show on TV. Okay, so from the trachea, we move down, and the trachea will branch into two major trunks, and those are called the bronchi. A bronchi is going to go from the, one bronchi is going to go into the left lung, the other one is going to go into the right lung. So that brings gas into each of our lungs. Once they enter the lungs, the bronchi break off into numerous bronchioles, and they continue to branch. They get smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually these branches will form the tiniest structures, which are the alveoli, and that's where gas exchange occurs. Now, the lungs, of course, are probably one of the most easily distinguishable organs in our body when we look at it. Physically when we look at them, but also if you look at them under a microscope. They're pretty easy to identify because they're basically empty spaces. So the lungs are, of course, the site of our diffusion of gas. They're found in the thoracic cavity. So in the thoracic cavity, you're going to have the lungs, left and right. You're going to have the heart, and then, of course, you're going to have the major blood vessels, the aorta, and the inferior and superior vena cavas, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins. They're all going to be in that thoracic cavity together. Now, since the heart sits a little bit left to the midline of the body, the left lung has an indentation, or it has a space that allows room for the heart to sit. The right lung is a little tiny bit bigger, and if we look at a picture, the right lung is divided up into 3 different lobes, but where the left lung is a little tiny bit smaller because of the space for the heart, the left lung is only divided into 2 lobes, and you'll see that in a picture in a second. Now, within each lung, we're going to have millions and millions of alveoli. Those are the tiniest physical spaces in the lungs, and that's where the actual gas exchange takes place. So at the very end of a bronchiole, the physical space will turn into a structure we call an alveoli. That alveoli consists of a single layer, so one layer of squamous epithelial cells. Now, those are the same ones that we had on the inside of our mouth, remember? Those fried egg cells, the small, flattened, irregularly shaped ones. And amongst those epithelial cells, we're going to have millions of tiny, tiny capillaries. Okay? And that's, of course, where the arterioles and the venules come together, and we can get that area where we get that leaky exchange where gas can go into the blood, and oxygen can go into the blood, and carbon dioxide can come out. Now, if we were to spread out all the tissue that's in the lungs, because it's really folded and really compact in there, we'd get about 60 square meters of tissue. Now, to give you an idea how big that is, 12 square meters equals about 1 parking space for your car. So if we were to take out all of the tissue inside your lungs, you would have enough for 4 and a bit parking spaces. You'd be able to cover that area with lung tissue. So absolutely amazing amount of tissue, and all that's there is to increase the surface area so that we've got the maximum space to exchange gases. It makes our lungs very efficient.